So now we're going to turn to our next speaker, who is Christian Rafael Parreño Roldán. I hope I said that okay. He'll present a paper titled Boredom, Suicide, and the Architecture of One Poultry Street, London. Christian Parreño is full-time professor of history and theory of architecture at Universidad San Francisco de Quito. His research delves into conditions of boredom and sameness in the modern built environment, and he's the author of a 2021 book titled Boredom, Architecture and Spatial Experience. It's a fantastic book, highly recommended, and it should be on our reading list. So join me in welcoming Christian.
Perfect. So apologies for that. Thank you, Josefa, Marius, Andreas. The past 2 days have been very inspiring. The presentations have helped me to clarify certain ideas, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to suggest further paths of research. For instance, boredom and environment, the architecture of animals. So what follows is not really an overall account or position about boredom and architecture. I think I've done that in my recent book, Boredom, Architecture and Spatial Experience, published by Bloomsbury last February. But rather, given the opportunity, I'm going to venture into a specific case of architecture and a specific aspect of boredom. The relationship between boredom and suicide has been acknowledged in many cultural expressions and intellectual elaborations. In Of Suicide, written in 1755, David Hume explores the sanctity of life by asking what is the meaning of the human capacity to provide for ease, happiness, and preservation if someone who, tired of life and haunted by pain and misery, bravely overcomes all the natural terrors of death and makes his escape from this cruel scene. To the philosopher, to Hume, suicide as a flight from the sameness of the world disturbs the order of the universe, encroaches divine providence, and therefore causes the indignation of God. This formulation posits boredom as an inescapable component of the human experience. If it arrives, it must be endured. Boredom and Suicide also structure Madame Bovary of 1856 by Gustave Flaubert. In the story, boredom leads to a series of desperate, transgressive, and morally condemned actions, which can only find resolution through the taking of the main character's own life. In 1897, Emile Durkheim dedicated a complete volume to the sociological study of suicide. In the seminal treatise, he affirms that high levels of anomie, a condition akin to social boredom, were responsible for high levels of suicide. And since the early 1980s, coinciding with the rise of postmodernism, the cultural interest in conditions of space, and the concern with boredom as a precursor of variety, creativity, and multiplicity, psychological analyses have associated boredom with dysfunctional behaviors, including suicidal tendencies. All these elaborations echo the early warnings of Thomas Aquinas about the power of acedia, a predecessor of modern boredom, by then combined with sloth, to induce pervasive and irrepressible misery. In Summa Theologica, which appeared in 1485, he says that acedia weighs upon man's mind, making him to want to do nothing. It is a sluggishness of the mind which neglects to being good. This sorrow is, according to Aquinas, always evil, since it impedes spiritual closeness to God on the account of the flesh utterly prevailing over the spirit. If acedia is not avoided through atonement, then it can overflow the sufferer with sorrow, and that overflow carries the risk of suicide, an unlawful act that goes against nature, the community as a whole, and the godly gift of life. The intentional taking of one's own life constitutes the definite disregard of the self and the immediate environment. Since the world emerges as a realm of indisputable and meaningless repetition, suicide becomes the final attempt to surpass the horizontality of transgression as a vertical leap into the promise of transcendence. If boredom can lead to suicide, and boredom is, in very broad terms, a discontinued, distorted, and negative reaction to the offerings of the surroundings, then does architecture have a role or agency in this relationship? If so, to what extent, and how does it operate? These interrogations pose architecture not only as the physical context in which boredom occurs, but also as a process in which the interiority of the individual, the space of thoughts and sentiments, encounter exteriority, the space of the body, society, and the world. Furthermore, architecture is not conceived as a cause of boredom and potential suicide, but as a situation that might trigger boredom and through its occupation inform everyday experience even more architecture. To explore this relationship of boredom, suicide, and architecture, I would like to refer to this building in London, number 1 Poultry Street, designed by renowned architect James Stirling. It contains shops at ground and basement levels, with 5 floors of offices and a roof garden. Located in the heart of the city, in one of the most prestigious sites, surrounded by a range of acclaimed historic edifices, it saw a string of 6 cases of suicide since the economic downturn of 2007. They were all committed by successful mid-career professionals who threw themselves off the public terrace in the 8th floor, 25 meters above the street level, where the exclusive Coq d'Argent restaurant functions. The first instance was not widely reported by the media, perhaps as it was deemed an isolated case. In the second, of 2009, a 24-year-old stockbroker jumped to his death, clutching a glass of champagne. In the third instance, which took place in September 2012, diners witnessed a smartly dressed Asian woman in her 30s plunged to her death, landing in front of shoppers and commuters, close to the entrance of Bank Underground Station. A witness at the restaurant reported, "The place was packed. There must have been 100 people. Everyone was just doing their usual, drinking and talking loudly. She walked to the corner and just jumped. It was extremely eerie." She is said to have taken a sip of wine and placed her handbag on the floor before falling from the viewing platform, as a public act, carefully designed. As a result of the first 3 cases, in 2013, 1.80-meter-high barriers were erected, and security guards were employed to patrol anybody seen alone. Despite these measures, In 2015, a 39-year-old male blogger and well-known restaurant critic jumped to his death. The day before, he tweeted, "Finally, thank you, everyone," with a link to a blog post saying that he was bored of life. Quoting Samuel Johnson, he wrote, "When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life. For there is in London all that life can afford." Johnson was right. I'm not tired of London and never have been. However, I'm tired of life. In addition, in the blog post, he recounted his life as a food commentator and the changing times of restaurants in London. He even mentioned his final meal, saying, "There seems to be a fascination on final meals, with many people online. Mine was at Hawksmoor Spitalfields, another exclusive restaurant close to the city." In 2016, a 29-year-old salesman traveled from Dublin to follow the same steps. Unlike the publicness of previous cases, this one passed unnoticed to diners and staff who only became aware of the death when police arrived. In his phone, several unsent messages were found. The first read, "I'm bored of life and the future possibilities disinterest me. It's nobody's fault. Nothing could have done to change it." The second, "I no longer try to adapt myself to others." The third, "I'm not made for this world." And the last, "I have cracked." The postmortem revealed there was no alcohol or drugs in his bloodstream when he died. When discussing the conclusion of suicide with the family, the coroner in charge said, "If you are going to jump off a roof in that way, having left those messages, I don't think there can be any doubt about it." Also, the coroner stated that the restaurant management had done all it could to make it difficult, if not impossible, for people to leave the premises other by the time they lived all these stairs. In the subsequent inquests, in all 6 cases, the architecture of the building, with its triangular plan due to its site, open atrium, rounded clock tower, horn-like projecting balconies, and a stripy facade, recognized as a masterpiece of postmodern culture in need of preservation, was cleared of any blame. Number 1 Poultry Street sits on a wedge-shaped plot of 10,200 square meters, at the apex where the eastern ends of Poultry and Queen Victoria Street meet at Mansion House Street. The site has a history of construction and destruction, of death and rebirth, of constant but slow transformation. There, it once stood St. Benet's Cherryhope, a medieval church in use for over 500 years, since the 11th century until it was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. The church was never rebuilt. Afterward, it became its namesake's burial ground, originally intended for wealthy residents, but mostly occupied by poor individuals, in use until 1853. In the 19th century, as part of the urban growth of London and its hygienist policies, the site was cleared and 8 Victorian Gothic structures were erected, contributing to the consolidation of the neighborhood as a zone of banking and commerce. The best known of these buildings was the Mapping and Webb Building of 1870, dedicated to luxury jewelry retail. It was designed by John Belcher, marking the corner of the site with an elevated tower and a clock on the main entrance. redolent of the capitalist motto, "Time is money." In 1958, a century later, Rudolf Palumbo, one of the most influential British property developers who made his fortune building on Second World War bomb sites, bought the first freehold of the site. He spent the next 25 years acquiring 12 other freeholds and 345 leaseholds to form the site for redevelopment. It was Lord Palumbo himself who in 1962 commissioned Mies van der Rohe, an epitome of modernist architecture, to design a skyscraper for the site. Featuring amber glass and a prismatic geometry, similar to the Seagram building in New York, it was presented to the public in 1969, shortly before the architect's death. The same year, the City Corporation of London gave conditional approval. However, after a lengthy battle, it was turned down at a public inquiry 15 years later. Palumbo, determined not to give up, then relinquished the design by Mies van der Rohe and commissioned James Stirling, considered not only one of the greatest British architects, but also one of the most important exponents of postmodernism, to create a new proposal. With the new design, a second public inquiry followed in 1988, and consent was given to demolish the 8 listed buildings. Then followed a High Court dispute with conservationists, ending in 1991, when the House of Lords finally approved Palumbo's plans, by then passed to his son, Peter Palumbo. After one more public inquiry, the construction of the design by Stirling broke ground in 1994 and finished in 1997, after more than 35 years of controversy and 5 years after the architect's death. Unlike the focus on urban presence of the proposal by Mies van der Rohe, Stirling's design revolves around a void, a cylindrical atrium with a triangular light well open to the sky. In its perimeter, it accommodates the lifts that connect the streets with the terrace. The surrounding walls of the void are covered in shiny blue tiles, and the windows feature bright artificial colors, resembling television or computer screens that demand simultaneous attention. The building is filled with wit, playfulness, humor. It has been compared to a nesting hen, a child's toy, a boat, and a submarine. Prince Charles, with contempt, described it as a 1930 radio wireless set. Furthermore, in line with the postmodern agenda of reincorporating communication into architecture, Number 1 Poultry Street marks provocative historical quotations, referencing Egyptian, Greek, and Roman rostral columns, which were erected to celebrate naval victories, and mimicking nearby celebrated structures. Its 2 long facades present oversized cornices and industrial windows. The exterior surfaces are defined by the layering of angular and curved forms, clad in stripes of salmon pink and pastel yellow sandstone, the liveliest stone, according to the architect. In its narrowest side, the building dominates the junction at Bank Underground Station with a clock tower, reminiscent of the clock of the Victorian Mapping and Web building that once stood there. But this sign of time now appears below jutting balconies that emphasize space, as if in postmodernity, space would have trumped time. As seen in the sketches and preparatory drawings, the design of the building originated in its demands for acceptance from its nearby counterpart, as well as for the acknowledgement of its uniqueness as a solitary piece. Although Stirling, an eccentric and even arrogant character, rejected the postmodern label, he did recognize that the style of the building was in direct opposition to the grey architectural modernism of mid-20th century. In 1987, while designing One Poultry Street, he declared with irony, "If we do another building in this country, it should be colorless, perhaps grey or brown, preferably the latter, or better still, maybe just invisible." Under this light of an architecture intended to procure liveliness and stimulation, avoiding boringness, the question of why it has become a symbol of existential boredom and suicide remains. Could it be the relationship of the building to emptiness? Exposing the vertical space of the atrium, the daunting panoramic view from the terrace, and the balconies confronting the void of the city? A possible speculation. According to Frederick Jameson, unlike the modernist concern with time, the concern with the space is one of the main features of the logic of postmodernism. To the philosopher, for whom boredom is a very useful instrument with which to explore the past and to stage a meaning between it and the present, space is the novum, the breakthrough, the radically emergent. The generalized interest in space, the so-called spatial turn, is a reaction to a waning sensibility that demands the search for diversity and multiplicity, against meta-theorizations and in favor of micro-narratives. In postmodernity, Jameson says, boredom acts as a historical symptom of our own existential, ideological, and cultural limits, an index of what has to be refused in the way of other people's cultural practices and their threat to our own rationalizations about the nature of art. That is to say, boredom indicates our situation, and that situation establishes a site, a position, an architecture. The architecture of number 1 Poultry Street can therefore be perceived as an effort to surpass boredom. But when that architecture, a landmark, the youngest listed building in the history of the United Kingdom, does not suffice, then the only alternative for those suffering from extreme boredom is the passing to another dimension. The building does not determine, but it seems to enable that situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Let me know if there are any questions. I'm going to check the chat and hands raised. There's a question, Christian. I don't know if you can see the chat. There's a question by Michael. It's the last comment I see. And he asks, could the rush of suicides in this building be unrelated to the latter, but really copycat suicides?
Yes, there could be something like that, but there is something else that seems to attract to this building. Nearby, there are 2 other suicide places in London, very nearby, like less than 100 meters away. One is in a very specific bridge over the River Thames, which was very much used in the 19th century. And there's another one in one big column that celebrates some sort of battle, which also was used for suicide. at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Regardless, despite those other places for suicide, then these people chose this other building, perhaps as a new kind of site of suicide. And this building, as I have tried to demonstrate, has a very specific architecture. So it was a chosen condition. It was not just that it was simply there available. It was something in the architecture of the building that seems to attract this very particular action.
Thank you. John has a question. John.
Thank you for your presentation. That was very engaging and spurred lots of thoughts I'm still sort of digesting. So I'm a psychologist, and so I guess I'm coming at it from that perspective and that point of view. And in psychology, there's a tradition in Gestalt psychology where they have a concept of affordances, which has some relevance, I think, in architecture as well. The idea that spaces or objects call out certain action for us, right? So, you know, a bench affords being sat upon, not just because of a cultural history, but because of our physical relationship with that object. So a tree stump would also afford sitting, or that we would perceive objects in terms of our ability to negotiate them. And so I'm wondering if there's something about the physicality of this building that affords suicide and jumping. And I'm wondering, you know, if that is one sort of angle to think about in this. I also wondered about the history. It struck me, you know, that there's this, to me, it felt out of place, but I'm not an architect, but to me, it felt out of place and it felt a bit garish, and then maybe that's my aesthetic. But I wonder if there's also a historical idea here about a lack of that continuity and sense of meaning for people. And so it represents something for them in that way as well. Anyway, just a few of my initial reactions. I'm going to have to reflect on what you've shared. There's a lot here to think about. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that psychology can help a lot trying to enlighten these kind of conditions. But I also think that there is something slightly perhaps bigger than that. And that is something that boredom affords, because boredom is a very fluid, very flexible condition. You know, what is boring for some is not boring for others, but also what is boring for us in a specific moment might not be boring at a later stage. And the history of architecture kind of proves that. You know, in the chat previously, we were talking about concrete. And concrete, for example, during postmodernism was a reviled material. It was considered the most boring material. But now it is one of the most revered materials in architecture. So while I do appreciate the approach of Gestalt theories about it, but I wonder how those theories could help us to explain this condition of constant movement, of boredom as such a flexible condition that seems to be there, that seems to enable certain situations, but at the same time is constantly changing.
Yes, thank you. That's helpful. And just to be clear, I don't think that the Gestalt perceptual ideas help us explain why that or any other object might be seen as boring necessarily in that broader historical fluid sense you've talked about, because indeed that's very important. I was thinking more about the specific act of suicide. But thank you for your response. It definitely addresses my question.
I think we have time for one more. Let's see, Abel.
Yes, I wanted to say something about the affordances discussion that John and Christian were having. I think it's a good way of talking, but I do not like to say that the building affords. I prefer to say that we do find the meaning or the function by placing. I know that probably this is not what you mean, John, but I'm just reversing it, making it more existentialist looking. The little child sees a house in the box, and the box is a house for the little child. The box affords it to become a house. But if we put it like this, it sounds to me a little bit too functional. And this is something that I mean particular, and I think the way Christian is talking might not fit how we use buildings. The function of the building is not the reason we appreciate the building. We don't appreciate the cafe because we can have a coffee. We can have a coffee in many places, certainly in a cafe, but also in the parking lot. We appreciate that cafe because having the coffee there seems to carry something else. We seem to like it more. And of course, this is very personal, as Christian has been saying, and we all experience. I don't know if I'm commenting on something that makes any sense or goes in any direction. I was just touching on the idea of the affordances that I think is very relevant here, John. And sometimes it might be the how we place it, whether we are the ones finding it or they seem to be there to be discovered. You probably make the emphasis that it is rather on us. And the meanings, of course, go beyond the things that we can do. The meaning of concrete or the meaning of the wood. Sometimes you tell people and they tell you concrete is cold, but yet people seem to like the exposed brick that I was talking about. And this will be very, very personal, the way we see. But I think it's crucial. We might be more willing to sit by that wall made of the material because we feel more comfortable. And what I will say is also the space is being created by the materials, and I will say also by smells, and I will say also by light, and I will say also by practically all our senses. We all have experience with light. With the smells, there is now more and more people saying that, yes, they can also change. And it's not just that it's a smell added to the space, it's that the perception of the space itself is being altered. Which is more difficult to swallow, but it's part of the idea. Sorry, that was supposed to be.
Yeah, I would simply like to add to that I think that in the case of architecture, it's very useful to think of boredom as a relationship. Something that Marius was stressing yesterday. So it's architecture proposes, the subject reacts, and some sort of conversation, some sort of exchange of ideas, sentiments, thoughts happen. So architecture does not determine, it informs, but also it depends on how we, the inhabitants of that architecture, react to those sort of things. So again, this question of to what extent architecture is present or relevant in boredom remains. And by architecture, I also want to highlight that is architecture in the bigger sense. It's not just physical, it's not just buildings. Think of virtual architecture. Think of the architecture that we're using to communicate us. So it's slightly bigger than that. And that understanding of architecture is also something that boredom provides. Boredom makes us realize that architecture is not just physical buildings.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is this might be a good segue into the next part of the conference, which I think starts now, I suppose, and it's the open discussion. So I'm gonna thank everybody for participating in the panel, for coming, and I'm just gonna stop talking and pass the floor to Josefa and Marius.